Welcome to this Think Small Cell webinar. Today we're looking at outsourcing small cell deployment and specifically how the processes and the automation tools to support those will need to evolve to support third-party outsourcing. I'm joined today by Justin Paul, Head of Marketing at Amdocs OSS Division, who will be giving the main presentation. His experience includes time with a mobile network operator, with cell site infrastructure vendor, and with back office vendors such as Amdocs. Now, the structure of the session will be a main presentation by Justin, including a couple of audience polls, followed by a question and answer session. And we'll take questions throughout the event, which I can put to Justin during that Q&A. The slides will be available and a recording will be posted and communicated by email to everybody who's registered. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Justin for the main presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm here today to talk to you about outsourcing small cell deployment and how the processes and automation tools can enable particularly third parties. I'm going to run through the following agenda. We'll talk a little bit about small cells. I think most of the audience will know what they are. Outline some of the deployment challenges we see, and talk a lot about the new players. I think what's interesting about small cells is how the market is opening up for non-MNOs. We'll then talk about the outsourcing models, some of the planning tool limitations we see today, the aspects of managing third parties, and talk a little bit about Amdocs' solution in the way of smarter tools and processes. And then, as David said at the end, we'll talk about Q&A. We'll go through questions and answers. So before we start looking at tools and processes, let's have a quick look at what we mean by small cells. And I think it's very important when we talk about small cells that we really say we're talking about public access small cells here, not the residential femtocells or even enterprise femtocells, very much focused on the small cells, so licensed spectrum, cellular base stations in the urban environment, which we'd call metro cells, or indeed sometimes rural and remote environments, which I know sometimes get referred to as meadow cells. So moving on to the next slide, let's have a look at some of the challenges of small cell deployment. I talked to a number of operators around the globe around small cells. It's obviously a very hot topic. And what's universal is that they all talk about the same challenges around small cells. And while they're a huge benefit to operators, they obviously create new challenges that they have to be addressed. And the first one is that operators are faced with significant increased complexity around rolling out this new technology. And if you look at small cells with 3G, then there are 4G and Wi-Fi, etc. And that causes some problems because they're also rolling out their macro networks and maintaining their 3G and in some cases GSM networks going forwards. The second thing is looking at the huge volume of cells that have to be rolled out. And while we're very familiar with the macro cell market, to put it in context, most operators are talking about rolling out 10 times more small cells than they have macro cells in the networks today. And they're planning to do it not in the 20 or 25 years where they've been rolling out these networks, but within 3 to 4 years. It's a significant task. And really the volume of small cells is something that is quite daunting for many operators. And tied into that, there's a lack of automation and tools and processes that then support that. And I think it's very important that the operators have those tools that allow automation, because without automation, you really can't address the issues of small cell rollout in an efficient manner. And the final thing is that you want to reduce your cost base for small cells. You want to reduce the skill base of the people that roll out the network. When I first started working in the network, working in this business, commissioning a base station on a rooftop site took 2 very highly trained engineers 2 full days to commission that. And now we're looking at a significantly reduced skills base. And if you can provide the tools and capabilities to de-skill the operation, you can make some significant cost savings. And indeed, I was talking to one operator who said, we plan to use the people that roll out the Christmas lights, put up the Christmas lights, to actually roll our small cell network. And that actually answered a question as to what the guys that put Christmas lights up do for the rest of the year. So moving on to the next slide. One of the other issues around small cells is, of course, the complexity around backhaul. And if we look at the traditional macrocell network, backhaul is relatively simple. In the good old days, you connected the network to an E1 or T1, and nowadays you have fiber or carrier Ethernet connecting the sites. I know some operators are using things like 10 gig fiber to connect their ENO-B sites. But when you look at small cells, there is significantly increased backhaul complexity. You have a huge range of choices available to you as an operator as to how you connect your small cells. And here in this slide, you can just see 3 of them. The one at the top is a traditional deployment using fiber, and fiber going from the small cell controller to a point of presence, and then using fiber to actually connect the small cells together. And this is the sort of thing you would typically see, maybe not in an urban outdoor environment, but very much in a location such as a mall or an airport or a transportation hub, where there's easy access to fiber, easy ways of connecting them together. It is a very efficient way of connecting small cells. But when you move to the outdoors, you're much more likely to see the use of fiber to a point of presence, but then some type of wireless technology being used, either line of sight or near line of sight technology, connecting to a wireless hub, which then connect multiple small cells. And you can see here an example where you're using line of sight, maybe a microwave, to connect to a wireless hub that then uses point to multi-point microwave to connect the small cells themselves. And then if you took the rural environment, for example, and I know there are issues with satellites in terms of latency and bandwidth, for some of the rural deployments, we are seeing operators very much supporting the use of satellite for backhaul, connecting the small cells over satellite back to the small cell controller. And part of the problem with small cells is you are given so much choice. There are so many options available to you, and actually you have to make a choice based on the technology, the environment, how many other operators there are, etc. It really is a complex area. So who's playing in the small cell space? When we first started talking about small cells, really a lot of our conversations with the mobile network operators, the assumption was that small cells obviously is a mobile network operator area, and other players such as multiple service operators, fixed operators, didn't really have a large part to play. And as we've moved along in our thinking around small cells, it becomes obvious that the small cell deployments that we're going to see, that we're seeing today and going to see, are going to open up huge opportunities for new players in the market. And I'm going to run through some of those. So the first one is obviously the mobile service operators, the cable operators, people that provide internet services today. They have a number of strong capabilities that make them a strong player to provide backhaul and connectivity and capabilities in the space. They often have presence on street corners, connectivity to houses, etc. And particularly if you look at the cable players with the TV services, because they've built their networks to support video, they have some very large bandwidth that they're able to play with. So they're the first new entrant to the market. We're also seeing, particularly the fixed operators, the traditional PTTs, very much playing in this space as well, providing connectivity to the small cells on behalf of the mobile network operators who typically don't have their own infrastructure at that level. And that's it for the telco players. But if we look at other players we're seeing coming into the market, we're seeing increasingly things like tower companies, the companies that such as American Towers, Goodman, BV, Arqiva, companies who have traditionally leased sites and provided sites are also now players in the small cell market. But most importantly and excitingly, we're seeing some very new players in this space. Anyone who has large numbers of street level assets is potentially a player in the small cell market. So you're seeing cities, city governments, municipalities, advertising companies, particularly those with digital signage, are very well placed because they have street assets, they have power, and they have lots of them. But also we're seeing things like transportation companies coming into this space because they too have a strong footprint, lots of assets, and some of them may even have their own dedicated networks that can be used to provide small cell backhaul, small cell connectivity. So it makes for a very exciting space, lots of new players in the small cell market. I think the next thing to talk about really is the outsourcing models. And a lot of the opportunities for small cells are driven by outsourcing itself. And I just wanted to sort of give a definition for what outsourcing is. So outsourcing is the transfer of day-to-day management responsibility as a strategic method for increasing the effectiveness and efficiency of network build and operations. And increasing the effectiveness and efficiency is really what small cells are about. If you can't get that efficiency and effectiveness sorted out, you're not going to get the real benefits from the small cell network and that provides an improvement over their macro cell or a supplement to the macro cell network. So if we look at the models, the first is site acquisition or leasing. And depending on the type of organization, sites can be owned or leased for small cells. Site acquisition is probably the hardest thing, as it's been in the macro cell space, one of the hardest things for small cell deployment. The ability to acquire or lease the right site in the right location as close as possible to the right small cell location is really important. And of course it has to be done at the right price. And there are organizations or MNOs are looking for organizations that can help them with that site acquisition or leasing. And that's why some of the, we're starting to talk to players such as advertising companies who have these assets and can lease them. I think the next area of outsourcing is around the network plan and build of services. Obviously, it's a significant task, and over the last few years, we've seen mobile operators reduce their engineering teams, their rollout teams, to a level that is much smaller than we've ever seen before. And now they have a significant task ahead of them, so they're looking to outsource, and they'll look to outsource the planning and building of those services and the design of those services increasingly. We also see some as-a-service models coming to the fore in terms of outsourcing. We see backhaul as a service, and this is particularly important for the MSOs and cable companies, where they're in a very strong position to be able to provide backhaul as a service to MNOs. And we've seen that in the UK with companies like Virgin Media and Colt offering services in this space. And really the final version of the outsourcing model is small cell as a service. Complete end-to-end turnkey offering for small cells, where a mobile operator will say, I'm outsourcing this entire piece of activity, all I'm owning is really the licensing, the ongoing operation, and in many cases MNOs will actually own the small cell hardware itself, but everything else is outsourced. And that makes for an exciting opportunity for us. So let's talk a little bit about the end-to-end process. The end-to-end process involves many stages and many different players, and that's one of the problems with small cells. Rolling out small cells requires a degree of coordination that hasn't traditionally been seen before in network organizations, because to get the efficiency and the effectiveness, there has to be smooth handovers across all of these areas. So if you go from, if you look at some of the areas involved, you've got the project initiation, planning, design, implementation, all the way through to network optimization. And all these different touch points and organizational teams have to work together, and they need an underlying process and tools to support the rollout of small cells effectively. And it's essential that those groups use the same processes and share the information and really focus on what we call one source of truth within the rollout process. Without that, mistakes get made, things get delayed, and basically the network doesn't roll out as quickly as you'd expect. Next slide, please. So if we look at the planning tools and processes available today, I think it's fair to say there are a number of limitations. Today's planning tools and processes often lack the end-to-end orchestration that we need to roll out small cells. And there's a number of different aspects I'd like to talk about. So firstly, that lack of end-to-end orchestration across the multiple systems and organizational groups. You also see tools that are unable to scale effectively across tens of thousands of small cells. And it's a significant challenge to have tens or certainly thousands of concurrent projects running at any one time. One of the things we've seen as well in the rollout is the inability to agilely manage in-flight project changes. Projects have been managed in quite a linear manner, and you need a solution that's dynamic to handle that. I mentioned this before, lack of a centralized information source, a single source of truth that every department, every organization, including third parties and contractors, are all feeding into and drawing information out of. And finally, there's often been a strong disconnect between the technical network design and the rollout. And again, to be efficient and effective in small cell rollout, you have to have a very integrated solution where technical design is highly integrated with the rollout processes. So I'm going to take a brief pause there, and we're going to run our first poll on the call. And the question is, which outsourcing model is most likely going to be adopted for small cell deployment? And the options are site acquisition or leasing, network plan and build, backhaul as a service, or small cells as a service. And I'd like to ask you now to vote. And there we see the results. So, very interestingly, the lowest level of outsourcing, the site acquisition or leasing, has scored lowest. Most of you believe that when we look at small cells, we're going to see a consistent move towards small cells as a service. So 43% believe the likely outsourcing model is small cells as a service, so the full service outsourcing. So thank you very much, guys. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges of managing third parties, because it's all well and good to outsource your network, but of course it's not without its problems. And the problems you see are, who, when, and where is probably the first problem. The traditional methods of project management often leave large areas of projects unaccounted for, and there are issues around responsibility and handover. It's vital that you understand who is responsible for specific tasks, when they're due to be completed, and when they've been completed. So that's the first one. The second challenge around outsourcing is around the contractual obligations. Usually when projects are handed off to third parties, they have contractual obligations around delivering their part of the project. And this involves delivery and completion time, cost, quality KPIs. And these have to be understood by both parties and well documented. The contract documentation has to be easily accessible for reference, for the relevant management teams during the course of the project. It's really important, if you are outsourcing, that you really understand who's doing what and whether they're in scope or out of scope. And tied into that is the accountability side of things. We need to know who is responsible, who's accountable, and sometimes you'll see third parties offering services that they then outsource some or all of that service to contractors, and they have to be managed in the same way. It's really important to understand who is accountable for every task if we're to get the efficiencies that we want. So that leads us to the next piece, and it's really key that we have a good third-party management process. The process has to be clearly defined and clearly understood and documented. It should be in place from the start. It needs to manage the interfaces, provide the points of contacts, manage information flow, reporting, tracking, escalation, and also problem resolution, because these projects always have issues. For example, a contractor may turn up to a site in a mall, they've been told the site is prepared, there's power there, and when they get there, the power supply isn't as they expected, or hasn't been switched on, or isn't connected. They need to understand, who is responsible for this, who is accountable for this, how do I escalate this issue, and how do I get back on track. It's really important. And of course, it needs to be automated and flow easily if it's to give you the efficiencies and the cost, reduce the costs of rolling out these networks. And the final piece is around the whole governance and SLAs. Small cells requires a strong governance program with regular communications, reporting, escalation, problem resolution. And really underlying that is the key is having strong service level agreements, and managing those service level agreements as well, so you know whether the project's on track, but also whether it's being delivered according to the SLAs. And organisations who've already developed an effective governance program are the ones best positioned to do this. So, what do we need to roll out small cells? I think the first thing to say is we need smarter tools and processes. We need tools that reduce the cost of rollout through increased efficiency. We need to speed up the time to market. Small cells are designed to be rolled out quickly, and what we need to do is make sure we have processes that support that rapid time to market. We need tools and processes that scale, because we're rolling out more projects than ever before concurrently. And one of our lead customers for this topic currently has over 2,000 concurrent projects running, and those go from a single small cell deployment to maybe a small mall with 10, 20 small cells being rolled out. 2,000 projects running concurrently, and that requires something quite significant to manage those projects. And then the final part of this is around limiting the risk. How do you reduce the human error? Take that factor out of the rollout, because if you don't do that, again, you have issues going forwards. And today, I think it's fair to say, the market is not well served by tools and processes to support efficient and effective small cell rollout. So I'm going to talk now about automating the rollout process and what Amdocs is doing in this space. And if you look at the diagram, there are three areas. We recently launched a product called Smart Cell Placement, a solution called Smart Cell Placement, which is really looking at the front end of the process, which says, where are you going to actually deploy these small cells? And it takes real-time network information or near real-time network information and looks at the network in terms of hotspots and not spots, but also correlates that with data that tells you where you get the best return on investment for your solution. It tells you as a network operator, where you get the best return for your rollout. Where if you're going to spend $1 million on rolling out small cells, where you get that best return. And that really helps you decide where, initiate the project, where the small cells need to roll out. The Amdocs small cell solution is really looking at the plan and design side of things. And I'll talk more about that, but it looks at dynamic process and project management. It looks at the whole process through the kick-off process for planning, design, project plans, and validation of the solutions all the way through. And then we also move into the area of installation with guided field force tasks. And I think this is actually an area that we will see growing as people seek to automate and de-skill the workforce. You'll see an increasing focus on what you can do in the field force tasks and guided tasks. So, what do we talk about? We talk about a catalog-driven factory approach for small cell rollout. And it really is, for us, it's been about industrializing small cell rollout. And we do feel a catalog, a central repository, a single source of truth is absolutely vital to an efficient solution in this space. So what we do is we create project flow blocks. So we're able to break a project into discrete tasks. And actually, you can reuse certain tasks, because if you look at a small cell rollout, there are certain project flow blocks that you can reuse. An example might be, if you're putting a fixing bracket on a lamppost, well, there is a process, there is a project that goes around that, but you can reuse that because typically you use the same bracket and you can define the same project block for each one of those, and you reuse that, so it creates efficient project plans. You're able to drop in blocks to create your project plan. And we use the same concept around the network design. We create network design blocks. For example, you might say, I'm going to use an IP access indoor small cell and combine it with an Ericsson microwave. And that's going to be my design A, or project plan A. But also for outdoor, I'm going to have a Huawei access point, a small cell, and I'm going to combine that with a Cambium point-to-multipoint radio, for example. And that will be your design B. And what we're able to do is use the factory process, the rollout factory in the middle of this diagram, that automatically decomposes the project requirements and combines them with the project flow building blocks to create a dynamic end-to-end technical design and associated project plan. And it's a project plan that if something happens, like the installer gets there and find the power hasn't been connected or isn't as they expect, you can go in, you can make in-flight changes and see what the impact of that is on the overall program, the project, and also looked at how you reshuffle the project to maintain maximum efficiency. So for us, it's about having a single design. You design once and deploy many times. So let's talk about the benefits of that. Well, the first benefit is it enables rapid plan generation, obviously. Both the plan and network design can be built automatically from project requirements. It's a highly repeatable process, and what we focused on is having something that's very much like a factory production line. And this is really important, particularly for the network design teams who, when you're rolling out a small cell network, are going to be under tremendous pressure because they're going to be asked to do significant volumes of work and activity, and they have significant complexity as well. The next thing is it's easier to maintain the whole dynamic project plan. You use Backhaul building blocks, which are easy to create. You reuse templates all the time, and you store those templates in the catalog for reuse another time. So you may have a site that has a fairly unique, or what you feel is a unique design. You have to create that design, but actually when you come across a similar scenario, maybe months or years later, you can take that same design and redeploy it. You don't have to start from scratch. And that's one of the big differences between macro cell deployments, where you see these very bespoke deployments. Each cell site is really a one-off design in many cases. What you're seeing here is the ability to understand where you've done something similar in the past, or created a similar design in the past, and reuse that for a similar problem area. And then, of course, looking on the on-demand side of things, it makes things much more flexible. You were able to create in-flight project plan changes. You were able to do workarounds. You were able to adapt for breakdowns in machinery. Perhaps your cherry picker is broken, or perhaps you've got sickness and you lose half your workforce because there's a flu virus or something like that. You were able to easily manage and maintain that project plan. So, moving on, let's have a quick look at some of the options for outsourcing. When we talk about outsourcing, as well as the models, I think there are different aspects we'll see people taking on board. I mean, the first is obviously the consultation and strategy. People looking at scoping, the framing, the risk analysis, and the planning side of the business. The high-level plans, how you're going to roll out these networks. We also see a discrete block around technical design services in terms of the offerings, particularly around the radio, cell planning, backhaul design, architecture. We see that as a discrete outsourcing block. We also see areas such as people managing partnerships and alliances, seeing how they can reduce the project risk by combining expertise and know-how, maybe outsourcing to specific players. You may even see organizations that roll out one network moving on to another operator's network to do the same thing again. And then the final, the highest level of outsourcing is around the full project management and governance. So complete outsourcing of the rollout of your small cell network. And we're going to move on to the second poll. I'm going to ask you to vote again. And the question is, looking at professional services, which professional services are most likely to be outsourced for small cell deployment? Is it consultation and planning services, technical design services, end-to-end project management and governance, or all of the above to a lesser or greater extent? And if I could ask you to vote now, please. Okay, interesting. And if we look at the results, what we're seeing is actually the first three are all tied with 14%, but actually the majority of you, 57%, believe that all of the above. So all of those services, to a lesser or greater extent, are likely to be outsourced for small cell deployment, which is both interesting and very exciting for the industry going forwards. So that brings me almost to the end of the presentation. In summary, when we look at the challenges faced by operators, they are significant. And I think if we look at small cells, the technology is here today, but we've not seen the mass rollout of small cells perhaps we expected. And that's not because there isn't market demand. We're not seeing heavy loads on the networks, 3G and 4G networks today. It is largely to do around the complexity of the task and the difference of the task from what operators have done in the past. The volume, lack of automation, and also the cost. How do you reduce the cost of rolling out these networks? How do you de-skill? So those challenges are significant. I think we are definitely going to see new players, and I think looking at the audience today, many of you are from those new players. I think there are huge opportunities going forwards for non-MNOs to play in this space, big opportunities to outsource, and I expect MNOs to want to outsource some or all of their small cell business to third parties. However, for anyone getting involved in that, there is a need for smarter tools. The planning tools, the processes, the approaches and methodologies that have been used in the past just won't work if you want to scale up to this degree and roll things out with a very, very fast time to market. We've got away with it in the past to have fairly inefficient services, processes behind macro cell rollout. We can't do that with small cells if we're going to roll the networks out that we want to. And key to that is having that common information, a single source of truth, and processes that pull out of that. And obviously, we're going to plug what we're doing. We do have a catalog-driven approach, and we feel that actually that helps address a large percentage of the issues around project complexity and scalability for third parties. Within the Amdocs solution, there's quite a large focus on service level agreement management and management of third parties, because we see that as really key going forwards. And I would say we're not talking about this as something, as a pipe dream or something inspirational. We are very much involved with rollouts at the moment with some tier one operators around the world. It is something that we feel we can speak with quite a great degree of credibility about. And the final thing I want to talk about was really, looking at outsourcing. I think there is a sliding scale. You'll see some operations, some operators will want to retain control, although only outsource small parts of their business. But I think I agree with the majority on the call that actually I think we'll see, to a greater or lesser extent, full outsourcing of these projects going forwards. So ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for your time. That's the end of my presentation, and I'd like to take your questions.
Thanks very much, Justin. That was a very clear and well-flowing presentation. In fact, one of the viewers is quite keen to see the slides, so just remind everybody you will get a follow-up email, normally 24 hours after the webinar, and that'll have links through to the slides themselves and a recording of this event. You can at any time during the Q&A session do submit questions for Justin through the panel on your right. We've had one or two come through already. But just before I ask the first one, there was a clarification question. You mentioned something like 2,000 concurrent active projects with one of your clients, and I just wanted to clarify whether that was one small cell per project, or is it common for each project to have one or a group of small cells being deployed?
It varies. So some of them are, sometimes a project is a single small cell, and that's often the case. But also we're seeing projects where you might deploy 4 or 5 small cells to cover a mall, something like that, and those would be counted as a single project. So certainly more than 2,000 small cells being deployed concurrently.
So when we hear of operators deploying in the order of, I don't know, 10,000 small cells per year, that might be, I guess it depends how many are in building and how many are these public access ones. That would typically require operators to be looking at certainly hundreds of active concurrent projects, if not thousands.
Certainly hundreds, if not thousands. I think thousands are, for the very, very largest of the tier one operators. But as you know, David, looking at Mobile World Congress, China Mobile talked about deploying 1 million small cells. So when you start to look at numbers like that, seeing thousands of concurrent projects is not too hard to imagine. But I guess for most operators, you're probably talking hundreds of concurrent projects rather than thousands.
Okay. So one question from the audience, you mentioned backhaul as a service, and they were just asking to clarify what's different or new between backhaul as a service as we know today to macro cells and micro cells, and that same backhaul as a service to small cells.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think the differences come to the changes in backhaul that are provided. And if you look at a lot of the small cells rolled out today, I think it's fair to say a large percentage of them have fixed connectivity. So we've seen lots of small cells rolled out in building, often in shopping centres and transportation hubs, where it's relatively easy to run fibre. A lot of new buildings have fibre run throughout. It's pretty easy to connect those up. And then it's a case of connecting your point of presence to the backhaul network. But what I think we're going to see with small cells, particularly as we deploy more and more outdoor small cells, is a much wider range of choices of technology. So we're still going to have fibre. That's going to be a preferred method for lots of operators. But there are going to be locations where you can't get fibre. You're going to see, I think, an increase in wireless backhaul. And of course, if you're a mobile operator, do you want to take on board managing multiple different wireless technologies? Probably not. And I think we'll see these services develop with vendors providing not just fixed backhaul connectivity, but a range of wireless services. I'd just like to plug here, there's a particular favourite technology of mine for backhaul, which is actually free space optics. It's something I've been involved in projects in the past, and I think it's a great technology for doing very short runs in an urban environment, because effectively using lasers, you can connect a small cell up very quickly, very efficiently to a point of presence. So if you wanted to put a small cell on a roundabout, but you didn't want to dig up the ground, and perhaps there was a lot of radio chatter, a lot of other microwaves and things like that on board, something like free space optics could be ideal depending on your smog levels.
Right. No, that's interesting technology to look at. We'll have to see how that takes off. On a slightly different angle here, question from one viewer who's looking more at the property side of things and the site acquisition. So he's commenting that there's been lots of activity and engagement from vendors and from the technical departments of operators, but relatively little engagement with the property interests around site acquisition. And I just wonder, he wonders whether you've seen anyone engage with small cells on these property issues. Is this perhaps one of the factors holding back deployment of small cells?
Undoubtedly it is. We had a customer visit this week in our offices, and we were talking about this very issue, and they said the number one issue holding up small cell deployment in North America is site acquisition issues. It is problematic. It's one of those things that you can't get around it. There's no way to bypass that process. You have to find a way of acquiring the sites. And I think if we look at our model, there is definitely scope for companies who are able to offer sites as a service, or agree to potentially an SLA to say, for a certain price we can find X number of sites in a certain location. I think that's we're going to see more players in that space. And that's why we're seeing some quite interesting new players coming into the market. So we've been having conversations with an advertising company. They do a lot of digital signage, and it's only since we had the conversations, when I walk around, I actually see their brand name, pretty much on every street corner. They have those assets, and they're actually in a position to go to operators with a portfolio of, these are sites that you could select from my existing pool of assets that you could just plug and play, and we'll give you a price. It's that much to connect to this type of digital sign, it's that much to go to another one. And I think that's going to be an exciting opportunity, and where we'll see some interesting niche players in the small cell space.
Thank you. A lot of your presentation talked about the process automation and the tools that the mobile network operator would use. Do you also foresee that these third-party subcontractors would themselves need to retool and have a different set of processes and tools, especially if, as we saw in the poll results, most of the audience believe that it will be small cells outsourced as a complete service?
I think looking at the size of the subcontractor, I would see some of the largest players in this space, some of the tower companies, some of the people looking to take on small cells as a service. Absolutely, they need to take these tools on board to drive the efficiencies. And of course, as we all know, if you're outsourcing, the more efficient you can be, the more profitable your business. I think for lesser outsourcing, perhaps the use of contractors, I wouldn't expect them to invest in these tools, but I would expect them to use the tools from the MNOs or whoever is running the program, because, as I said before, we need to have this single source of truth. And one of the key things to know is, are your projects on track? Are people meeting their SLAs? Are they hitting their quality targets? And part of the challenge in the past has actually been, because you've had lots of disparate systems, it's taken a long time to filter that data through and actually to understand where operators are in the rollout. And interestingly, I know, talking to an operator today, it took them a long time to realize that actually their third-party contractor was very, very far behind in the whole rollout process that they brought on as a managed service. With the system we've talked about today from Amdocs, you would have real-time or near real-time, certainly on a day-to-day basis, an updated view on how your contractors are doing. You'd be able to break that down across regions, across the various subcontractors, see which ones are most efficient, which ones are giving you the best quality, etc. And that's really important. It only really works if everyone's utilizing the same tool set.
Okay, again, changing tack slightly, you did mention some in-building applications, the shopping malls. Perhaps some people would see airports or certain transport hubs as in-building. It depends on your definition. But would you see the scope of this this tool, this process, being equally applicable to the in-building enterprise market? Given that at the beginning of your presentation, you kind of indicated that that wasn't what you were primarily addressing.
I think the short answer is yes. I think what we've got with this platform, the underlying platform, is something that's very powerful to support almost any form of rollout in volume, and we're in conversations around using it for macro cell rollout, carrier Ethernet, fiber to the home, etc. I think with some modification, it could be very, very easily used for managing some of the enterprise femtocell deployments. What you would need to add to that would be some level of building planning, the ability to look at the building in the same way we do today with our smart cell placement, look at the macro networks or the existing networks to see, where those spots, where those access points and small cells need to be deployed. But in principle, yes, very much so.
Okay, and one comment about the end-to-end process that you talked about on one slide. Is this really radically different from the rollout of a macro, or is it just that we need to do lots of, scale up the volume, but basically do the same things?
I mean, yes, it is fundamentally different. I mean, at the basic level, it's about putting a radio out in the network and providing coverage and capacity. So from that point of view, from the radio access level and the network level, it's very similar. It's almost exactly the same. It's the same technology, very, very similar. The challenges are that it's vastly more complex in terms of the variables. So for most macro networks today, you pretty much have a choice of tower sites or rooftop sites. There are some variations on a theme, but that's what 95% of networks are made out of. And while the engineering infrastructure changes significantly for those, you've basically got two forms out there. What you'll start to see with small cells is a vast difference in the types of access points. So for a start, you've got a much larger number of vendors available to you that you're going to use. You're going to have a huge choice of backhaul. You're going to have a huge choice of ways you attach the small cells to various aspects. So you can't use a lamppost fixing bracket to attach a small cell to a digital sign. You have to have a lot of control. And one of the things we've done with our solution is, in terms of improving workforce management and the whole task management, actually for each design you would get a kit list that says, if you're going to put this on a lamppost, you need a lamppost fixing kit, and you need to take this kit and this piece of wire and this cabling, and it comes as it's all about packaging and creating kits and automation. Because there are so many variables, it's that much more complex. And I think a number of operators they've run trials, and they've run trials using the methodology they use for rolling out macro cells. And it does work, you can do it that way. The challenge comes when you come to scale. Because of all these variables, you just can't cope with all the variables and the volume. Something's got to give, and what gives is time to market.
Great. So I think we've really only got time for one last question, which is perhaps a slightly cheeky one from one reader who's keen to understand just how many companies are already using your product, your tools in the North American region. I appreciate for commercial reasons you may not want to answer that, but I think it'd be helpful if you could perhaps just give some indication of how available or how close to commercial use these products are.
I can't name the company, so it's actually more than one, and it's being used for more than one technology. But I can say it's a tier one North American operator who's rolling out thousands of small cells. There are a few of them, but it's a pretty small set. But we are engaged with lots and lots of operators globally who are all seeing this problem. And one of the issues we're having with this is, while a lot of operators are they've come out of their trials of small cells, they've been largely trialing the technologies themselves. What they haven't been trialing is how they're going to deploy in volume. And we're seeing a lot of interest in this space for that reason, because they're realizing the technology works, but actually the challenges of rolling that technology out are significant still.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Justin. That's the time that we have available for the Q&A. Just wonder whether you have any sort of final closing thoughts before we wrap up.
I just wanted to say, I feel the small cell market is a really exciting one. I recognise it probably hasn't taken off as fast as we all had hoped, those involved in the industry. But I do feel very strongly that 2015, 2016 are really going to be the years where small cells take off. And I think what's exciting about the market, even more exciting about it, is the opportunities for so many new and different players. And I hope in that capacity I'll meet some or all of the attendees today. And I wish you all success in your businesses in small cells.
Okay, thanks very much, Justin. And as you can see on the screen, if you'd like to follow up with Justin or his colleague Phil Bull, who gave a similar related presentation a couple of months ago, then their contact emails are shown there, as well as their website. In terms of housekeeping, I'd just like to make everyone aware we will send out an automated email to you all within normally 24 hours, and that'll have links to the slides that have just been presented. We'll have a full recording of this event available to view on demand. And of course, if you want any wider or related information about small cells, then do of course visit thinksmallcell.com. And if you've not already signed up to our monthly newsletter, then I'd strongly recommend that you do that again on the front page of our website. So with that, one final vote of thanks to our presenter, Justin Paul, and we'll wrap up the session now. Thanks very much for your attention.